Well, hello and welcome once again to the DCL podcast, where we're inviting you to sit back, relax, and we'll be on our way shortly. Well, welcome back to the DCL podcast, your podcast to help you and your family cruise a little smarter when the ship starts sailing. And we are going to turn our focus in a totally different direction. We are going to do, this is a type of podcast, and I'm going to be completely honest, I'm a little nervous about doing it because I've never done anything like this before. So I knew I was going to have to bring on somebody quite a bit smarter than I am. So I'd like to welcome to the show today, all the way from Notably Disney. He's been on our show several times talking about his and his family's cruises. Welcome back to the show, Brett Nachman. How are you doing today, Brett?
Hey, Steve. Thanks for having me back on. Glad to be here.
It's my pleasure. And, I knew when this book came out, we were going to have to talk about it, and I knew I was going to need some support on it. So I really want to thank you, and I appreciate you coming on to talk about it with me today.
My pleasure. I'm glad to see finally another book related to Disney Cruise Line. There aren't many out there, so this is a nice chance to dive right in.
No, there's not. And it would kind of hit me. It kind of blindsided me when we had Jim Korkis on last year. As we were talking, he made mention that he was in the middle of writing a book about Disney Cruise Line, which I had not heard anything about. A lot of times his books come out, and I'll be honest, I'm not sure if I follow him enough to know what he's up to and what he's working on. And they'll just pop up, and all of a sudden there'll be a history book about Christmas at Disney.
Yeah, it seems like he's producing probably at least 3-4 books a year. They just kind of at times come out of nowhere, and they're like, wow, learning about different facets of the Walt Disney Company. It's always exciting when there's new Jim Korkis books debuting.
Definitely. So this one's called Hidden Treasures of Disney Cruise Line, Nautical Notes, Knowledge, and Nonsense. And it's been out for a couple months now. You can pick it up on Amazon and at themeparkpress.com. I believe you can, but I was supposed to look at that ahead of time. I think you can buy them through there, and you can definitely get it for your Kindle as well. Do you know, Brett?
Yeah, absolutely. All those platforms for me, I downloaded it on my Kindle Fire. So it's very readily accessible. I think on Kindle Fire, it's maybe $5. And if you buy just a paperback, it's I think maybe like 18 to 20. So pretty reasonable.
So before we jump in and talk today about the book itself, let's do a little background. And you kind of did some digging into who is Jim Korkis. Now, we had Jim back on episode 137, which came out last March, and we talked to him about the history of Disney Cruise Line, and he touched on a lot of the things, or some of the things that we're going to talk about today. But Brett, who exactly is Jim Korkis?
I think that's the ultimate question, Steve, because Jim Korkis has been in our Disney world for many decades now. Some people may know him as a former performer in Walt Disney World. He was an animator with the Disney Institute, and I know there's some really cool footage on YouTube that shows some of that. He's also been a presenter for the Walt Disney Company in a variety of different settings. But over the past decade, he's become more visibly known as a writer of, I'd say, probably at least a couple dozen books, most of them through Theme Park Press, perhaps even all of them. And the Vault of Walt series is perhaps the most notable line of books that come from Jim in terms of these collection of interesting stories that relate to different facets of the Walt Disney Company. And as I said at the top of the show, it seems like he's constantly producing books, usually at least a few per year, whether it's continuing Vault of Walt, sometimes some interesting kind of new directions. I know there was one that was focused on outer space and more intergalactic Disney-related tales. It's always an interesting ride with Jim because he's the type of individual who you can tell is a natural storyteller, and I think that was readily apparent when he was on your show, as he mentioned. He has these really fantastic and elaborate ways of transporting you as the listener or the reader into a certain time and place. And he's been on a number of other Disney podcasts as well, and I've listened to many of them over the years. So many folks know him as really a good Disney historian and someone who knows his stuff. And he actually wrote a book called How to Be a Disney Historian, which is a great title for people who are up-and-coming writers and podcasters and researchers on the Walt Disney Company. And I know I've used that as a resource too. So certainly Jim Korkis is synonymous now with Disney history, at least in this more modern age, and is a good person to be able to translate stories that are sometimes kind of hidden and not necessarily the most recognized. So for those reasons, I think Jim Korkis is a really wonderful storyteller.
I totally agree. And I got hooked into him with the Vault of Walt series. I'm actually reading the Vault of Walt Volume 8 Christmas edition. It's Christmas, so
very timely.
It's a great time to do that. But I did not know that he actually wrote a history one. So I'm going to have to go back. That was published in 2016, it looks like. And I think that the thing that's neat about Jim's books and what I've really enjoyed is you hear a lot of the big stories over and over and over again, but he focuses a lot of times through his books on a lot of the smaller side stories that a lot of us don't hear, or maybe they're not as big or as splashy, so they don't get the bylines that some of the smaller stories do. So those are some of the things that I've really enjoyed about his books.
It makes a lot of sense, and I think that's why particularly those of us who are really entrenched in discovering everything related to Disney, he really writes for more of the aficionados, but in terms of those kind of smaller stories, as you're talking about there, Steve, but yet his books are also mainstream enough to appeal to folks who maybe have an interest in, as I mentioned earlier, Disney in space. So there's your entry point. So I think that's a good trait about an author, to be able to have those really hardcore Disney fans and also appeal to more general audiences.
Well, you can hear Jim Korkis on several different podcasts. He's been on Lou Mangella's podcast several times on WDW Radio. And then he recently appeared as well on the Book of the Mouse Club podcast. And I really enjoyed that episode because generally on most of the episodes that Jim does on podcasts, he's talking about Walt Disney history or Walt Disney himself. And then on the Book of the Mouse podcast, the most of the focus was on him. So it was kind of interesting to hear his story.
Like I said, I'm always a fan in listening to him and hearing stories that even supplement those that are found in the book.
Okay, so let's talk about the book itself, Brett. You kind of, before we started recording, you said you kind of had like an overview of just how the book was laid out or set up. And why don't you touch on that before we actually jump into some of the things that he talks about?
Yeah, of course. So I think what's important to know in going into this book, it's really a reference book at its heart for people who want to know some of the small details about Disney Cruise Line, whether it be elements of the artwork on the ship, backstories of Castaway Cay, learning more about the statues on the ships. There's a lot of really cool hodgepodge type content here. But what actually begins the book is the way it's framed is actually telling about the roots of Disney Cruise Line. And for that, you have to learn more about Walt Disney's days on the seas. And I feel like that content is actually covered just as well, if not even a bit better, in Jeff Curdy's book, Travels with Walt. But it talks about kind of Walt's connection to the seas and ultimately what led Disney to pursue expanding its reach into the cruise line industry. So there are some chapters on the development of not only Disney Cruise Line, but also predecessors of sorts, and we can certainly go into that. So the book doesn't necessarily follow a certain narrative or format. It's rather a mix of a lot of different aspects of Disney Cruise Line and the inception of the cruise line as well.
I really enjoyed that book by Jeff Curdy, as you were talking about, Brett. And I think that one of the things about Walt is that a lot of the focus on him and a lot of the history and stories you hear is how important trains play in his life, from leaving from Marceline, Missouri and going out to California. Of course, all the different, Disney parks all have a train associated with it. But one of the things that I picked up from reading Jeff's book was how important actually the ocean liners played in his life as well. And one of the biggest trips he did with his wife and then also his brother, they went to Europe and they actually took trains to riverboats and finished up on an ocean liner. And ocean liners played a very important part of his life throughout his life, didn't it, Brett?
Yeah, and it's kind of neat as a thread line, so to speak. Like, could Walt have ever visioned at that point that the notion of the theme park industry or whatever that would be would ultimately extend to sailing the seas? And mind you, this is many decades beforehand, but maybe a precursor of sorts.
Definitely. So he not only did he take the ocean liners over to Europe, but the one that I thought was kind of interesting when he went down to South America, the whole El Grupo during World War II, he actually took an ocean liner home from South America it was a way to disconnect a little bit after kind of the pressure of being down there and before he got back to the studios. And then they also went out to Hawaii several times on the ocean liners.
That's really cool.
So from there, Jim kind of threads the story, and he moves it ahead quite a while when they start talking about Disney taking over the Queen Mary, which was located out in Long Beach. Did you pick up on that a little bit, Brett?
Yeah, and what's a really fascinating connection here is that the Queen Mary was run by the Rathers, who actually owned the Disneyland Hotel until Disney basically bought the rights to it in the late 80s. So that purchase kind of coincided around the same time and just shows Disney wanting to expand its reach and ownership in Southern California.
The Queen Mary, all of a sudden they've got the Queen Mary. They also have actually, I'm not sure did they own the Spruce Goose as well, or did that just happen to be next door? I don't remember now.
I want to say yes.
Okay.
That sounds right to me.
Yeah, so they've got these two properties out there. They got to figure out something to do. So they come up with this concept of what they were going to call Port Disney Sea in Long Beach. And they were going to basically build a destination for people to come down and visit the Queen Mary, visit the Spruce Goose, and of course there would be shopping. And I think they were actually going to put some rides in as well.
Yeah, and what's cool is, and mind you, I feel like this has been covered in a few other spaces. There's some great videos on YouTube where folks have like little documentaries of what Port Disney could have been, but in a written form, I haven't seen too many instances of it, at least not at length. And what Jim really covers nicely here is giving context to what this park/entertainment district/port would have resembled, and there actually would have been elements of what would ultimately come to fruition with Tokyo Disney Sea. So there's a reference to Mysterious Island, which is the centerpiece of that park. So, the notion in Disney is good ideas never die, and ultimately these manifested elsewhere. But Disney's concept for Port Disney would have been very extravagant, ultimately a blend of several different concepts that in a sense we've seen in other places. Kind of some of what was described reminded me of Disney Springs and those types of spaces, but in a very substantial way. I quite enjoyed learning more about it and seeing how this entertainment enterprise would have just been an amazing place to visit as a complement to Disneyland, because ultimately we're talking about places that are not just a few miles away. Like, you'd definitely have to take a little bit of a trip out there. So what could have been, and even thinking about Westcott, which also didn't come to fruition and really isn't discussed, but I always think of that as a very interesting era in the Disney company history, and really by virtue of Eisner wanting to expand Disney's theme park reach. We saw that later on with Disneyland Paris too, and the financial disaster that was initially. So it was a really cool time in the company.
We're kind of touching on these. You can get so much deeper into all these topics, since there's several podcasts and there's several books that have dove into these topics as well. So we're kind of just, barely skimming the surface here. But from there, I thought this was kind of an interesting story, and I've seen the pictures of it. But Jim Cora, who was the Disneyland International, he was the first vice president and later chairman of Disneyland International. He helped put together Tokyo Disneyland and Euro Disney, and he happened to be at a party, and he's talking to a Navy admiral, and this Navy admiral goes, "Hey, I've got this aircraft carrier, and I don't know what to do with it." So Jim Cora kind of laughs about it, and then he starts thinking about, since he's been kind of, working on these international parks, what if we put a theme park on a boat, and then we could take it to all the different countries that don't actually have Disney theme parks?
Oh my gosh, it's such a fascinating idea, and really just the notion of Disney thinking outside the box and actually moving fairly far into this process. The SS Disney, as I guess it would have been called, would have been a floating theme park that would have traveled all around the world, being stationed at different ports for 2, 3, 4 months at a time, moving on to another space and not returning back to that whatever that prior port was for another several years. And you probably remember too, Steve, just the notion of it's basically like Disneyland on a boat, because you would have a bunch of the Fantasyland and Tomorrowland attraction, or maybe a few of the Tomorrowland attractions, but also boat ride attractions like It's a Small World on the ship, but not on water, but rather more of an omnimover concept akin to the Haunted Mansion.
And unfortunately, this idea, they actually pivoted and said they would have to put it on a tanker, not an aircraft carrier, because that would be bigger, and they would allow them to do that. And it would actually entail them to have 3, or was it 4 ships? I can't remember now. I think it was 4. And what's funny is they end up with a fleet of 4 eventually, with what we have today with the modern Disney fleet, before the Wish joins it, of course.
Right, because there'd be the main vessel as you discussed, and then there'd also be just the vessels that carry all the cast members, and even like I feel like even a barge for fireworks or something along those lines. So it would have been like this traveling crew of vessels. Fascinating.
Serious circus there. But what ultimately brings them down with a lot of Disney projects is just money, and then also being able to work with the labor unions at each one of the different countries, as they would have to bring people in from each country that they visited to help, run the parks and run the entertainment as they tied up for the month or 2 months, however long they were going to be in port there. So that idea gets kind of pushed aside. And then we have Michael Eisner, who is running the company, and he's starting to expand Disney World. He's talking about the Disney Decade, and you really see him start to build all the different hotels around Walt Disney World. He wants people not to just come down there for a weekend or for a couple days. He wants it to be a resort type experience. And in doing so, he becomes enamored with the new burgeoning cruise industry, which is happening in Florida.
And mind you, like this was still a time where a ton of people weren't cruising as they are today, or at least, taking the pandemic out of the picture. And you know this as well as anybody, Steve, it's an industry that has changed dramatically by virtue of where are ships sailing, what are ships ultimately holding for the passengers in terms of activities and entertainment, and where are they going. So this was, the late 80s, this was still a time where cruises were associated as being something that, honeymooners go on, or perhaps seniors, but not necessarily the family demographic.
So Michael decides to dip his toes into the water, per se, by partnering up with Premier Cruise Lines, and they were running several ships which they called the Big Red Boat. And Disney's idea was, come down, hit the parks for 4 days, and then go jump on this cruise ship for 3 days and go enjoy yourself out there, and then, or vice versa, do the cruise first and then go visit the parks. But just a way to expand, a way to keep people down in the parks a little bit longer and kind of just enhance their experience by offering the cruise experience as well.
It just shows Disney's versatility and kind of challenging themselves to do something different. And this was an accessible platform because, they didn't have to, at this point, they didn't have to build the infrastructure. They're kind of just joining forces with Premier Cruise Line.
Right. So they add their characters and they help build some. What's kind of interesting is actually Pirate Night was developed on the Big Red Boat and by Premier Cruise Lines, not by Disney per se. So they actually had a Pirate Night with a pirate buffet and everything on there. So I thought that was kind of an interesting side story for where that may have come from.
Yeah, kind of like a guinea pig experiment, seeing how that works.
Yeah, so that goes on for a couple of years, but then Michael comes down and he goes and he spends some time on one of the cruises, and he realizes that by partnering with a cruise line, they don't have full ownership control over their, what's the word I'm looking for?
I think you got it.
Their experience. Well, they want to control the whole experience of the individual from the time they enter the ship and sail around and get off. And he realizes that they've already got the experience as a company of running hotels, of telling stories, of offering entertainment. All they need is people that actually know how to sail the boat itself. And so they start looking in that direction to build their own cruise line.
And I think this just shows Disney's innovation, right? This was kind of uncharted territory for them. Yeah, they got a little bit of exposure through partnering with Premier, but it just shows, it makes me think back to when, Walt and his team developed Disneyland. There wasn't really a theme park industry. There were some amusement enterprises, but here, there's obviously a burgeoning cruise industry that's happening in the 90s, but ultimately not for families. So this is Disney kind of tapping into its creativity and unique resources to carve out a new place in the marketplace.
And to be fair, there's so much more to the story. There's so many more angles, because at one point he was looking at possibly partnering with Royal Caribbean after they cut their ties with Premier Cruise Lines and possibly going that way before they ultimately decided to build their own ships, which happened in 1998. And the first ship that was built was over in Italy. That was the Disney Magic over at the Fincantieri cruise yard over in Italy. And they started sailing in 1998. And from there, the book kind of pivots, because that first 3 or 4 chapters is all just kind of this history to build up to where the cruise ship starts. And where does he go from here, Brett?
Oh, it's very hard to follow, Steve, because it seems like anywhere and everywhere, you'll find tidbits on a handful of pages related to the restaurants, and then you might be jumping and talking about the artwork on the ships. It's kind of as I said, a hodgepodge is the best word to describe it, because there's not a clear structure. And that's both the beauty of the book and also the complexity of it as well, that there's just so much interesting stuff, and you have to kind of read into the details to uncover some of that.
So we don't want to ruin a lot of the fun little stories that Jim provides in the book itself. I thought it was kind of fun to just build up the history a little bit to get us to where we are today, 1998 being the beginning of the cruise line. Of course, now we have 4 ships, the Disney Magic, followed by the Wonder, then the Dream, followed by the Fantasy, and of course in 2022, the end of 2021, hopefully she'll be floated out, but 2022 we'll see the Disney Wish join the fleet as well. So instead of actually talking about all of the different aspects and kind of ruining the fun stories that the readers or our listeners can go and discover for themselves, I thought it'd be fun to just maybe pick out 1 or 2 or 3 fun stories that you found in the book. Brett, do you want to start off, or should I jump into one?
I'm not sure if I'd say a story so much as just an interesting component is to recognize the level of really thoughtful measures DCL implements as it pertains to environmental standards. So certainly when we're on the ships, we recognize that there are, little cards reminding people to be mindful of, how much water they're using and certainly, staying clean, all that. But this was interesting, like a little tidbit that condensation from the AC is used to wash the decks on the ship. And I'm like, wow, that's a great way of repurposing water. There's an environmental officer on board the ship. That caught my eye. I'm very much into sustainability, and one of the inner battles I deal with as I go on cruises is realizing that they can be at times very harmful to the environment. So it encourages me to see some of the different policies that Disney has in place to make use of resources wisely. It also makes me think of even in the theme parks and how the railroads are run on, I want to say, like the oil from like the fryers or something like that from like, I seem to remember a detail along those lines. So it's just being very ingenious with using what you have. And certainly when you're on a ship, you don't have as much to draw from. So certainly if you can repurpose stuff, all the better.
It's funny because I actually wrote that one down myself as far as the environmental impact that Disney had. And I thought it was kind of neat that the dark blue paint that they have is actually a special paint, which reduces harm to the environment. And it's also, not only does it reduce harm to the environment, it actually, because of, I don't know, I'm going to just use a word here, which is not probably correct, but the slickness of it makes the ship much more efficient as it sails. So that reduces how much energy that they have to use and oil they have to burn to actually move through the water. So I thought that was kind of an interesting tidbit.
That is awesome. And, that makes me think, too, of, and I think this was detailed in the book, when the fireworks launch and ultimately the shells land in the water, it basically disintegrates into fish food for the fish. So
yeah, so a lot of fun stories. One of the other ones that kind of caught my eye, too, was the fact that each ship has a godmother or god. I don't know if they have a godfather, so just godmothers, but there was kind of a fun story about the Wonder, and that, well, I guess there was 2 stories that I thought was kind of fun, but we'll start with the Wonder. The Wonder was actually the first ship, at least the only ship in the Disney Cruise Line fleet that was actually christened at night. And the reason why is because, do you know who her godmother is?
Is that one Patricia Disney, or is that the Magic?
Patricia Disney's the Magic. So the godmother of the Disney Wonder is Tinkerbell.
That's right. Okay. Yes, character.
Yeah. So the reason why they did it at night was so that they could kind of use their Disney magic so that Tinkerbell could fly along the ship and sprinkle pixie dust as she was launched.
The next time you're on the Wonder, just walk over to Tinkerbell and ask how does it feel to be the godmother of the ship, and see how she responds.
That's it. Put her on the spot there a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah. So, and the other one I thought was kind of neat too was the godmother of the Disney Dream is Jennifer Hudson, and I know you're familiar with her.
Yeah, and she has a Disney Cruise Line connection, as I'm sure you'll share.
Yeah, so she actually got her start performing on the Disney Wonder in 2003. And then when the Disney Dream was launched in 2011, she was picked to be the godmother of the Disney Dream, which I thought that was kind of a neat story, too.
All good tales, for sure.
I digress on this one. I hesitate to put this in because I can't remember which character it was. I'm pretty sure it was Admiral Donald. But the actual Admiral Donald statue, which you see in the atrium, It's the actual statue now, but when the ship was originally built, they built a replica, and the ship workers at Meyer Werft took the original one and kept it in Germany. And so for years, it was just the replica floating around. And eventually, yeah, Florian told this story on one of our earlier podcasts. And eventually, I can't remember. I'm going to have to go back and take a listen to this one and get it out to people so it comes out exactly correctly. But eventually, the original Donald, the actual Donald that was built, is returned to the Disney Dream. And now he is sailing happily with the Dream wherever she goes.
Well, that's very reassuring.
Yes. Admiral Donald is in command of the Dream, and I'm sure he is controlling his temper, and things are going wonderfully smooth right now. So how about you, Brett? Any other stories kind of jump out at you?
Maybe not stories, but what I really like about a lot of Disney reference books are lists, and lists that really help you uncover stuff that you may not be able to compile on your own. So one of them is that there's a whole list of all the different porthole animation for the magic portholes in some of the interior staterooms on the ships. By no means is it exhaustive, but it's thorough. That's
kind of neat. I've actually never stayed in a stateroom with a magic porthole. Have you?
I have not, so it was kind of cool to get that context.
And to see what all was on there. One last one to kind of finish up on, and then we'll kind of wrap up the book a little bit here, is I thought it was kind of neat that they introduced Captain Minnie in 2019, and I don't think that you've been on board to be able to see her yet, have you, Brett?
No, not that one.
Captain Minnie was introduced in 2019, and what I thought was neat about that was just kind of to be able to expand to broaden who serves on the Disney ships. And so not only does it give young women and girls somebody to look up to and aspire to, but they also partnered with the LGM Academy, Maritime Academy over in the Bahamas for female cadets who want to be captains or leaders on the ship. And every year they pick 4 people to start that 3-year program. And they pick 4 because there's 4 ships. I thought that was kind of neat from the Disney company or from Disney Cruise Line to kind of look towards the future and expanding, making sure that their positions are open for everybody.
Oh, yeah, representation matters, and I think Disney Cruise Line is definitely being more visible in that type of space, so I'm glad to see that.
So he finishes up with Lighthouse Point, a short chapter on that, and the fact that Joe Rohde's leading that, or he was leading it until he recently retired, but he was leading that project where they were going to focus a little bit more on the Bahamian people and the Bahamian culture. So the one thing that I did find was kind of fascinating that was Castaway Cay has, and I'm not going to go into the story behind it, but they had an original backstory, but it was so long and nobody remembered it that they came up with a much shorter one and a more modern one.
Yeah, and that's what's kind of interesting about the book, too. Like, certain pieces of content get a lot of attention across a number of pages, and the whole backstory aspect of Castaway Cay gets a lot of coverage in the book. And again, I don't think this is something that's terribly well known, and I even wonder to what extent certain folks may find it fascinating, but there really is a lot of rich storytelling going on, and ultimately, and I think I probably would have wanted a little bit more detail about this, is just the acquisition process. It's referenced across some pages, but like there's a very short reference to how films like Splash were filmed on Castaway Cay. I would have loved more on that, because that's something all I see and hear is little details like that. That simply would compel me even more.
I feel like this book in some ways, well, let's just pivot to that. Was there anything else that you wanted to talk about that was in the book itself before we kind of just talk about the book itself?
Yeah, I think just a couple things. One is that there's a high seas glossary of terms to familiarize folks with different nautical language, which I think is helpful. I also loved little details like the whole list of different sweets you can get at Vanellope's for folks who have. I haven't actually visited that since it opened, but it sure made me hungry. And I just had a laugh with all the fun names from Sugar Race and those characters. But ultimately, I think this is there's so much really niche detail that I think will either land with certain people or others may not find the most fascinating. I found a morbidly interesting fact to be that the storage room on the ship can accommodate several bodies, which ultimately these are things that you don't think about when you sail, but unfortunately negative things can happen when you are out at sea, and Jim doesn't shy away from that, which I think is also important.
Okay, so I don't know if we're going to pivot to kind of giving our overall thoughts on the book,
Sure.
but I think this was like you said, it's a very niche book. If you're interested in those small little details, you're going to love it. There was a lot, if you've been studying kind of Disney Cruise Line, you've been on a lot of Disney cruises, you've been to the Art of the Theme show tours that they offer on each one of the ships, I think that you're going to know a lot of the stuff that he has on here, but you are definitely going to find some hidden gems as well. And if I would give it like maybe one overview, is that I think that there's another book there that he could write. To kind of expand on some of the topics. Like I think he does a good job covering a lot of them. Some he goes into detail, some is just kind of a little bit of an overview. I thought the dining room information was really more of kind of an overview, like this is what happens here and this is what happens there, with not much more expanded there. I'm not sure if there's that much more that could be expanded, but as you said, like with Castaway Cay, with the different movies that were filmed on it, I think there's a lot of areas or places where he could probably expand and write another book.
So this is where the book strikes me as one part history book, one part reference book, one part just small details for the biggest DCL fans. And in that sense, it can appeal to a wide variety of audiences, but the tone and structure is very inconsistent. So I think that's how you have to approach it. It serves what it aims to. And I think, per your point, additional books could be centered exclusively on particular topics. I kind of would probably prefer a compendium history book. And for this, there's elements of that, but basically it's leading up to the cruise line's launch. And then from that point forward, there's some other historical facts scattered, but it's more of a reference book.
Overall, I love the little details. I love the history. I'm with you, Brett, in that I would love to maybe, be a little bit more consistent as far as, bringing that history all the way through, and then maybe having another book with all these little details attached to it. But there were a couple times, such as when he was going over the chandeliers of the ship, where he talked about chandeliers in all three ships except for the Wonder, and he just left the Wonder out. So I think in some ways I felt like this book, as I was reading it, felt a little rushed in certain spots.
I think that would be totally a fair assessment. And I felt that too. In giving critique of books, I want to recognize that there are other factors in play. And I think one thing that did strike me was at times they were, for instance, you mentioned the chandelier and the lack of reference to one of the ships. There were other instances of that where perhaps I think I remembered the Disney Dream being mentioned very prominently as it pertained to certain topics, and yet the other spaces on the other ships were not. So I think that's where I would have liked a little bit more balance, and perhaps that's by virtue of personal experiences and what one is more familiar with or where there's greater research on. But I would have liked a little bit more consistency because, again, not everybody has sailed on all the ships, and you have to recognize that if you're covering a topic, it should be more complete as opposed to like little pieces. So that was just a little critique, but also recognizing that there is a lot of really cool, unique content in here. So if you want to learn more about O'Gill's Pub, great. You have several pages on that. So you're covered.
And I don't want to come across negatively whatsoever, because I really did enjoy this book, and it's easy to critique from the cheap seats because I've never myself written a book, and I know that it's got to be quite the endeavor. And Jim has obviously, proven himself to be a very prolific writer and historian with all that he has produced. So I would definitely give it a 2 thumbs up for anybody who wants to learn a little bit more about Disney Cruise Line, especially some of the niche aspects of the different ships and some of the history behind it.
Oh, yeah. I think for certainly listeners of this podcast will find it to be useful, and I wouldn't be surprised if they already own a copy. And I think a lot of people will ultimately find this to be a useful tool, particularly those who are defining themselves as Disney connoisseurs, because like we talked about already, there's not many books not published by Disney that focus on the cruise line. There's a few of them, and certainly, the unofficial guide to Disney Cruise Line, that's a planning book, and there's some little details about the history that are great. But yeah, I think from the standpoint of finding a lot of content in one place, it's hard to. So this book certainly does the job.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on and helping me talk about this subject. It's not something I've ever done before, and I knew I was going to need somebody a little bit more of an expert when it comes to books and whatnot. And in saying that, one of the fun things that I've been able to do over the last couple of years, and I know that many of our listeners are doing as well, is to listen to the podcast that you started. And it does focus on literature, Disney literature, and music. So I was wondering if you could talk to our listeners, Brett, a little bit about your podcast, what's going on with it, and how you got it started.
So notably, Disney is entering its third year very shortly. And ultimately, if folks aren't familiar with it, it's a podcast, as you said, centered on Disney music and books. And it's one part interview show where I talk with authors and songwriters, musicians, fellow Disney fans. And then the other part, in addition to the interviews, oftentimes there are episodes centered on specific topics. Like, for instance, earlier in 2020, Jim Fanning, who's a Disney author and writer, came on as we talked about favorite forgotten Disney songs that perhaps aren't as familiar to most Disney fans. So it's really a hodgepodge of a podcast in terms of sometimes the content, but generally all of it falls under the notion of recognizing really great Disney books and music, and that might be across theme parks, films, Broadway, all different domains of the company. And it's a really great opportunity to both familiarize folks with some really cool people associated with Disney, but also honor the amazing books that are released and the music that is from the rich legacy of the Walt Disney Company.
So a lot of the podcasts, a lot of us that jump into the whole podcast realm, we pick our show based on something that interests us. So I'm guessing that this plays a huge part in your life, the music and the literature of Disney.
Absolutely. Yeah, for me, I never thought that I would develop a podcast. I think as a kid, I probably liked the idea of being a talk show host. That was a career goal. Obviously, that did not come to fruition, but one way I've been able to channel that is to host my own podcast. And it's so commonplace now for folks to have the resources to do this. But I was listening to podcasts as far back as 15 years ago, and many of the few Disney podcasts that existed back in 2005 focused primarily on the parks or the company more generally. But one thing I've noticed, even with the expansion of a number of different niche podcasts, and certainly DCL podcast falls under that umbrella of being very very distinct, is that there's very little in terms of specific podcasts that are centered on Disney books or Disney music. So Book of the Mouse Club had launched, I think, maybe a year before mine did, and I certainly knew that as a big reader, as a former journalist, and as a researcher in education, I love to read, and that defines a lot of my life. And I've always loved learning about Disney, and books have served as my gateway for having greater breadth of the company and its many parts. So I knew that would be a good topic, but I certainly didn't want to replicate the good work that Courtney and Emily do at Book of the Mouse Club, and I decided to merge the book idea with my passion for Disney music. I listen to music all the time, whether it be background loops at the parks or songs. I play the piano, so music's also integral to my life as well. And I thought, why not blend the two? Because a common thread between music and books is the idea of language. And in music, we can think about it in terms of lyrics, and that obviously being inherent in songs, but also music has its own language in terms of the tone that you're striking and the story that you're sharing. And it can be subtle, but music has that effect. And so I thought, wouldn't it be awesome to blend the notion of Disney music and books into a podcast where I could kind of cover both of these domains within all the different aspects of the Walt Disney Company. That served as the roots of Notably Disney. And basically, I had the seed of an idea for a couple of months, but it was pretty quick in terms of turning that into action. And I actually used you as a resource, Steve, to get some ideas on how do you start a podcast. And certainly as a big podcast listener, I'm familiar with different styles and types of shows and who you're basically appealing to. So in developing my podcast, I was drawing on my understanding of the podcast world as a listener, but also my background and skill sets as an interviewer, because I knew I wanted that to be a really core component of this. How I was going to do that, I had no clue, but I also knew that, this is a world where we're all much more interconnected, and I could probably reach out to some folks and land them as guests.
Well, I want to give you a huge shout out if anybody has not listened to your show, Brett, because if you're interested in Disney history and music and the books, the literature, but what you do on your show, what Courtney and Emily do over at Book of the Mouse Club, and Dan Heaton over at the Tomorrow Society, I think that you get all three of you guys are just amazing shows, and you bring out, and yeah, it's niche to an extent, just like Disney Cruise Line is, but you bring out a lot of stories that have not been told by people that have done some just amazing things for the company. And a lot of times, the bigger people on top, and this is no derisiveness towards them whatsoever, but there are just so many people that work for this company that have provided some just amazing entertainment and quality, whether it's music or literature or film to us, the kind of consumers. I think the stories that you've been able to tell are just amazing. And one of the ones that you brought out, which I really enjoyed, was Brendan Milburn, who wrote the music for Toy Story the Musical, which is the first musical that we actually saw on Disney Cruise Line on the Disney Wonder back in 2015. And it has long since gone from the Disney Cruise Line fleet. But I just remember being, sitting there in the Walt Disney Theater watching this production as we're floating around up in Alaska and just kind of admiring what they bring to the ships.
Absolutely, and that was a real pleasure. And I also want to highlight Brendan's songwriting partner for a long time, Valerie Vigoda. They co-wrote the music for Toy Story the Musical and had them on separate episodes, and they each told some really interesting stories about that production. Ultimately, you're not going to be able to find much on the web about it. I remember there was maybe a 3-4 minute YouTube clip that Disney Cruise Line produced that talked about the making of it, but there really wasn't much backstory publicly released. So for me, this was really cool. I had remembered seeing both of them at the very first D23 Expo back in 2009 and thinking to myself, wow, this is a dynamic pair. They were telling some really cool stories with some other Disney musicians and songwriters who have actually since been on the podcast. And I thought, wow, it'd be really cool to be able to learn the stories from the folks themselves, particularly because they hadn't been uncovered. Like, who would have known that there was actually a Toy Story 2, the musical, in development? So that I had no clue about, and I'm glad that was able to be unraveled.
So I think those are some of the amazing things that the three of your podcasts, and yours in particular, Brett, are bringing out to people. So I really want to encourage any of our listeners out there who, if you have not listened to Notably Disney, to Brett's podcast, I would love for you to go over there and check it out, because he's just got so many amazing stories in each and every week. And it's one of those things that's like, I feel like it's, my wife gets Stitch Fix. Do you know what Stitch Fix is? So,
no.
Stitch Fix is this company that you kind of tell them what you like as far as clothing, and then each month you get this box in the mail, and you get to open it up, and it's almost like Christmas to find out what you're going to get. And I feel like that's the way your podcast is to me, because I do not have the backstories or the history that you have with a lot of the music and whatnot. And so a lot of the names that'll pop up and I'm like, oh, who is this person? And I just love diving into it and the interviews that you do with them and the stories they tell. So I just wanted to make sure that I commended you for the work you're doing, and definitely, point our listeners your way if this is something that would interest you as well.
I appreciate that, Steve. And yeah, you point out some other great podcasters in our Disney community, Courtney and Emily. You mentioned Dan Heaton, who's also been a guest on Notably Disney, and so many others. And I think what so many of us collectively do is bring on people who have that connection to the Walt Disney Company. And I think also, too, many of us podcasters try to enlist folks who aren't well-known names. So you mentioned Brendan, Valerie, as the songwriters of Toy Story the Musical. Like, I couldn't find much content on their connection with Disney. They're quite great songwriters in their own right, and outside of Disney, but in terms of the Disney connection, it was limited. And so in addition to bringing on composers like Bruce Broughton and Richard Bellis and John Debney, who are fairly well-known names, I would hope, in the Disney music community, and well-known authors. We've both had Jeff Curdy on, who's a beloved Disney author, Didier Getz, who wrote the They Drew As They Please series. So those are folks who have commonly been on different Disney podcasts. But what's also been important to me is trying to bring on folks who aren't as quote-unquote household names. It's been a real pleasure to enlist some folks who are perhaps earlier in their careers or haven't gone as much attention. The Imagineering story on Disney Plus is a must for any Disney fan. So to talk with the composer who really brought the magic via the music to the visuals that we see on screen was a true pleasure. And it's always a quite a treat to be able to talk with folks who are maybe not household names, but are really lending their skill sets to Disney books and music.
So it's been 2 years. I'm assuming there's going to be a third season of Notably Disney, Brett?
Yeah, and it's cool to think about it along the lines of seasons because it makes it feel even more professional. But what I'll say is that what lies ahead on Notably Disney this January. So occasionally on the show, usually I release 2 episodes a month. In January, and certain months I'll release a few more episodes. So there's going to be some content on essential books that if you are a Walt Disney World fan that you should own. So I'll have some guests who are going to talk about that with me. Also clever Disney songs. So there's a great wide variety of tunes in the Disney library, but how do we define cleverness and how do they appear in Disney films? We're going to be talking about that. And I also have hopefully a very exciting composer interview on the docket as well. Wow. So a lot more to come for the next year.
Well, that's good to know, and it's good to hear that you're still going to be producing some more just amazing shows, and I look forward to listening to each and every one of them. So, Brett, today, I really want to thank you once again for coming on and helping me tackle what to me is a difficult subject, talking about books and how to break them down. And I really want to encourage everybody to, once again, if you're interested in Disney Cruise Line, the history, or just some of the smaller aspects of it, go out and check out Jim Korkis's book, Hidden Treasures of the Disney Cruise Line, Nautical Notes, Knowledge, and Nonsense. And as Brett said, if you don't want to buy the actual book itself, it's all of his books are very reasonable through Kindle, usually running around $4.99 or $5. And I've also found that just a couple of them are at our library as well. So if that's your way of looking for Jim's books, you can try and look for them as well there. So as we kind of wrap it up, Brett, thank you so much for coming on today. It's always a pleasure to catch back up with you, and I want to wish you and your family all the best over the holiday season.
Thank you, Steve. Same to you.
Well, that's going to wrap up our show today. Once again, I really want to thank Brett for coming back on and helping me look at Jim Korkis's new book, Hidden Treasures of the Disney Cruise Line, Nautical Notes, Knowledge, and Nonsense. And if this book interests you, I really highly encourage you to go over to Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, wherever you can find books, you'll be able to find this book and many of Jim's others. And once again, if you have not listened to Brett's podcast, I really encourage you to go over and check out Notably Disney. He just came out with a podcast today as well, and he's got just a lot of fun content and interesting content, especially if you're interested in music, books, and a lot of history behind the Walt Disney Company. So once again, we are kicking off 2021. We got a lot of fun podcasts coming your way. Our next show, as we kind of focus on the return to cruising, is going to feature one of our port adventures. We're going to look at Alaskan port adventures in particular, so look forward to that show next week. If you would like to help support the podcast, you can do so via our Patreon program. You can go over to patreon.com/DCL podcast, and you can find out all the information there. Also, if you have not done so, and all of us here would really appreciate it if you go over to iTunes and leave us a review. That helps us get a little bit better known in the podcasting community, the Disney community, and of course the Disney Cruise Line cruising community. So thank you for each and every one of you who have done that before. And if you have the time to do that, we sure would appreciate that as well. Well, between now and our next show, if you are heading out on your next adventure, your staycation, vacation, wherever it may take you, if you're just dreaming of vacations, on behalf of myself, Steve, Christy, and Chris, all of us here at the DCL Podcast, we want to wish you and your families all the best. Be well out there, and we'll see you next time on the DCL Podcast. The DCL Podcast is not affiliated with the Disney Cruise Line, Walt Disney Company, Adventures by Disney, or Run Disney. All of the opinions expressed on our shows are those of the hosts and the guests who appear on the show. If you have any questions about any of these products, please contact the Walt Disney Company.